On Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, families have spent 2 centuries answering a question they were taught never to ask out loud. Why do these particular eyes run so dark? Why does the skin on this side of the family turn a deep brown by July, while the neighbors 2 hollows over stay pink and burn? For generations, the answer inside these households was Portuguese, or Black Dutch, or sometimes Cherokee, 3 words passed down like inherited china, fragile explanations nobody was allowed to examine too closely. Then the DNA kits arrived. Grandchildren mailed off cheek swabs expecting a tidy confirmation of the family story, and what came back instead pointed toward a population that geneticists have spent 3 decades trying to properly name. Not Portuguese, not fully Cherokee, something older and considerably more American than either story ever led on. The word for it is Melungeon, a term that has followed a cluster of Appalachian families since before the Civil War, first as an insult, later as a rumor, and now, because of a genetic study 2 decades in the making, as a documented fact sitting inside the blood of thousands of people who never thought to look for it. If your family used one of those old cover stories, if your people lived along the Cumberland Gap corridor where Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky meet, or if a census taker once wrote a word beside your family's name that quietly disappeared from the record a decade later, this is the story that explains why. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what the 6 signs genealogists watch for actually mean, you have to go back before there was a United States at all, to the early decades of English settlement in Virginia. In the 1600s, the racial categories that would later govern American life had not yet hardened into law. Indentured servants, free black colonists, and native families lived and worked alongside one another, and on occasion married across lines that a century later would carry criminal penalties. Virginia's House of Burgesses passed a law in 1662 establishing that a child's status followed the mother rather than the father, a legal shift aimed at controlling the growing number of mixed children born to English men and enslaved or free black women. Then, in 1691, the colony went further, passing its first statute explicitly banning marriage between white colonists and black or mixed-race colonists, a law the legislature titled, without much subtlety, an act for the prevention of that abominable mixture and spurious issue. It took several more decades of legislation after that to fully close every loophole, and in the narrow window before those laws hardened, and along the frontier where enforcement was thin at best, mixed families formed anyway. That window closed faster than it might have otherwise because of an uprising in 1676 known as Bacon's Rebellion, in which poor white indentured servants and enslaved black laborers fought side by side against the colonial government, an alliance that badly frightened the Virginia planter class. In the years that followed, colonial lawmakers moved deliberately to separate white servants from black laborers through law, privilege, and status, tightening exactly the kind of cross-racial cooperation and cross-racial family formation that had made the rebellion possible in the first place. The families who would later be called Melungeon formed in the years just before and during that hardening, which is part of why their origins sit so awkwardly between the neat categories the law was working so hard to build. Some of those families, pushed out of the more settled Tidewater counties as the racial code tightened around them, moved west along the same wagon roads that carried thousands of other colonial settlers into the backcountry. They followed the Great Wagon Road down through the Shenandoah Valley and into the mountains, looking for land nobody else wanted badly enough to fight over, and the mountains gave it to them. By the time European surveyors and land agents reached the Clinch Mountain and Cumberland Gap region in the mid-1700s, they found communities already settled on ridges like Newman's Ridge and in hollows like Vardy Valley, farming corn and running hogs, worshipping in their own churches, and marrying almost exclusively within a small, tightly connected group of families. These were not new arrivals staking a claim. They were already there, established enough to have their own burial grounds and their own church congregations, decades before Tennessee existed as a state at all. Nobody has ever fully settled where the word Melungeon itself came from, and the disagreement is its own small piece of evidence about how mysterious this community was to the outsiders who named it. Some linguists have pointed to the French word mélange, meaning mixture, possibly carried into the Appalachian backcountry by French traders and trappers who worked the region before English settlement took hold. Others have proposed a Turkish or Afro-Portuguese phrase, Melungeon, roughly meaning cursed soul, arguing the term drifted into English through Mediterranean sailors who passed through colonial ports. Neither theory has ever been proven, and the honest answer is that the word may simply have been a garbled, localized slur whose exact roots were never written down by anyone who cared to explain them. What is certain is that by the time it reached the page at Stony Creek, it already carried the full weight of an accusation. The earliest written use of the word Melungeon that historians have located comes from the Minute Book of Stony Creek Primitive Baptist Church in Hawkins County, Tennessee, dated 1813, where the congregation recorded a complaint against a member for, in the language of the time, harboring those Melungeons. The word was already an insult by then, and nobody at Stony Creek bothered to define it in the record, which tells you the people using it assumed everybody already knew exactly who was being talked about. By the 1840s, the word had made its way into Tennessee's political vocabulary as well, surfacing during a contested state election dispute in which one candidate's opponents accused him of winning office on votes improperly cast by Ridge families whose racial standing, and therefore whose right to vote at all, was being publicly questioned. A word that began as a church rebuke had become, within a single generation, a tool for stripping a community of its political voice, and once a word carries that kind of power in a courtroom or a ballot dispute, county officials rarely feel much pressure to define it more carefully than the accusation already requires. What followed over the next several decades was a slow legal tightening that mattered enormously to these families. Tennessee's Constitution of 1834 restricted voting rights, jury service, and militia enlistment to free white persons, reversing an earlier constitution that had allowed some free men of color to vote. That single clause meant a family's legal classification was no longer a private matter of local custom. It determined whether a man could vote, whether his testimony counted for anything in a courtroom, whether his children were permitted inside the common schools being built across the state. Census takers, tax assessors, and county clerks became, almost by accident, the gatekeepers of an identity that could shift a family's entire legal standing from one decade to the next, and the surviving record shows exactly how unstable that classification could be. A household recorded as free persons of color in one census might appear as mulatto in the next, and then, 2 or 3 decades later, the same family might be recorded simply as white, with no explanation offered anywhere in the paperwork for the change. Genealogists tracing Melungeon surnames through county archives have found this pattern repeatedly, and it is worth sitting with what it actually represents. It is not evidence of a clerical mistake. It is evidence of a family, or a sympathetic clerk, willing to look the other way, making a deliberate decision about how much the official record needed to know about who was really living in that house. This brings us to the first sign genealogists look for, and it is the simplest one to check. A specific, relatively short list of surnames recurs constantly through the documented Melungeon families of Hancock and Hawkins counties in Tennessee, and Wise and Lee counties in Virginia. Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, Mullins, Bolin, Sexton, Denham, Minor, and Sizemore appear again and again in the church records, tax lists, and court documents connected to these ridge communities, and researchers who have spent years building out the Melungeon DNA project have used exactly this list as their starting point for identifying eligible test subjects. Working backward from documented 18th and 19th century wills, tax rolls, and marriage bonds to confirm which living men could trace an unbroken paternal line to a specific ridge ancestor before ever asking them to send in a sample. None of these names are unique to Melungeon families elsewhere in the country. A Gibson in Georgia or a Collins in Ohio proves nothing on its own, which is exactly why genealogists pair a surname match with the second sign, geography. A documented family line running back to Newman's Ridge, Vardy Valley, Blackwater Creek, Snake Hollow, Mulberry Gap, or the surrounding stretch of the Clinch Mountain Corridor in the 1700s and early 1800s carries far more weight than a surname alone, and it carries more weight still if later generations of that same family appear migrating into the adjoining counties where displaced Melungeon households are known to have resettled, Wise and Lee counties in southwest Virginia, and eventually Letcher and Magoffin counties in eastern Kentucky, as land on the original ridges grew scarce and later generations followed the same coal and timber work that pulled thousands of other Appalachian families further into the mountains. It is the combination, a recognized surname sitting inside a specific and narrow geographic pocket across multiple generations, that starts to build a genuine case rather than a coincidence. The third sign lives inside the census records themselves, and it takes patience to find. Pull your family's entries across several consecutive census years, starting in 1830 and running through 1880, if the records survive that far back for your line. Look specifically at the column recording race or color, which shifted in label and placement from one census year to the next, but was almost always present in some form. A family that shows up as free person of color in one decade, then mulatto in the next, then white by the turn of the century, without a documented reason for the change anywhere else in the county record, is showing you exactly the kind of quiet reclassification that Melungeon families used to protect their children's legal standing as the laws around them tightened. Consider what a typical Hancock County household's paper trail might look like across those decades. An 1830 entry lists the family under free persons of color. 20 years later, a different enumerator, working the same district, writes mulatto instead. By 1880, in a household living on the very same land, a third enumerator has written simply white, with the older entries never corrected and never explained. This is not a subtle shift once you know to look for it. It is usually visible at a glance, and it remains one of the clearest paper trails a family can leave behind for a descendant willing to go looking a century and a half later. It is worth pausing here to understand the scale of what this actually covers, because it is easy to picture a single isolated hollow and miss how far this population eventually spread. The core group documented on Newman's Ridge and in Vardy Valley in the early 1800s numbered only in the low hundreds, spread across a few dozen households, but those households had large families, generation after generation, and as land on the ridge grew scarce, sons and daughters married out into neighboring counties and carried the same surnames and the same ancestry with them. By the time the great waves of 20th century migration pulled Appalachian families north into the factory towns of Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan in search of work, descendants of those original ridge families had scattered across a large stretch of the country, most of them with no idea that a cluster of surnames and a family story about Portuguese or Cherokee blood connected them back to a few dozen households on a Tennessee ridge 200 years earlier. There is a practical wrinkle worth knowing before you start pulling these records yourself. Census taking before 1850 did not name every free person individually. The schedules from 1790 through 1840 listed only the head of household by name, with tally marks recording how many people in that home fell into categories like free white, free colored, or enslaved, which means an ancestor's individual racial classification in those earlier decades often has to be inferred from the household total rather than read directly off a line with their own name attached to it. 1850 was the first federal census to list every free member of a household by name and by race, which is exactly why so many family historians find the paper trail on this question gets dramatically clearer, starting at that specific census year, and murkier the further back past it they try to push. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The fourth sign is the one that finally moved this from folklore into hard science, and it came from a DNA study published in 2012 in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, titled Melungeons, a Multi-Ethnic Population. Researchers Roberta Estes, Janet Lewis Crane, Jack Goins, and Penny Ferguson worked for years to identify documented male descendants of the core Melungeon surname families, tracing paper genealogies back to specific ancestors on Newman's Ridge before testing their Y-chromosome DNA, the marker passed down essentially unchanged from father to son across countless generations. What they found surprised almost everyone who had followed the story for decades. The Y-chromosome results came back overwhelmingly European, tracing largely to the British Isles, which meant the fathers of this founding population were, genetically speaking, ordinary English and Scots-Irish settlers, no different from thousands of other colonial patrilines. The surprise sat on the maternal side. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down only from mother to child, told a different story entirely, showing lines tracing back to African and Native American ancestors rather than to Europe at all. Put together, the two results describe a specific and historically plausible founding pattern. European men partnering, whether through marriage, informal union, or arrangements the surviving record simply never spells out, with African and Native American women, at a moment in colonial Virginia history when the legal walls between those groups had not yet finished being built. The researchers found the pattern held consistently across multiple documented family lines rather than appearing in just one isolated case, which is precisely what gave the study its weight. That pattern is now the fourth sign genealogists point to. A DNA test that shows African or Native American ancestry concentrated on the maternal line, sitting alongside a European majority elsewhere in the results, matches the documented Melungeon genetic profile far more precisely than a scattered, evenly distributed mix would. For anyone looking at a modern autosomal test result from one of the major consumer companies rather than a specialized Y-chromosome or mitochondrial panel, the sign tends to show up in a smaller, quieter way. It rarely appears as a large, obvious percentage. More often it shows up as a modest trace amount of sub-Saharan African or indigenous American ancestry sitting inside a result that is otherwise heavily British Isles and broadly Northwestern European, a few percentage points that a lot of people either dismiss as noise or simply never notice tucked at the bottom of the ethnicity breakdown. For a family with documented roots in the ridge counties of Tennessee, Virginia, or Kentucky, and a surname on the list, that small trace amount is not noise. It is very often the fourth sign confirming itself in exactly the place genealogists have learned to expect it. The fifth sign is the story your own family told, and it is worth taking seriously precisely because families rarely invented these particular explanations for no reason at all. Portuguese was one of the most common claims, sometimes shortened in family speech to Portuguese, and it served a specific legal purpose rather than a purely descriptive one. 19th century law in much of the South drew a hard line around anyone classified as black or mulatto, but Portuguese ancestry, however implausible it may have been in a given family's actual history, placed a person outside that line and inside the protections reserved for white citizens. Black Dutch served a similar function in families further north and west, offering a European-sounding explanation for darker features without inviting the legal consequences that came with any admission of African ancestry. The claim of Cherokee or other native ancestry did similar legal work in communities near reservation boundaries, where a documented tribal connection could sometimes offer protections a claim of African ancestry could not, even as it created its own complicated relationship with actual native communities and their own citizenship roles. None of this means every family that told one of these stories invented it out of nothing, and some almost certainly did carry a genuine thread of the ancestry they claimed. It means the story was doing legal and social work that had very little to do with strict literal accuracy, and modern genealogists who hear one of these three specific explanations passed down through a southern Appalachian family have learned to treat it as a flag worth investigating rather than a settled fact to dismiss outright, and rather than one to accept without further evidence either. The pressure behind these cover stories only intensified as the 20th century arrived. Virginia passed its Racial Integrity Act in 1924, a law that legally required every birth in the state to be recorded as either white or colored, with no room left on the form for anything in between, and that pushed a definition of whiteness so narrow that even families with long documented European ancestry could be reclassified if a registrar decided their features or their neighbors' rumors suggested otherwise. Other southern states passed similar statutes around the same period. For a ridge family that had already spent a century managing its classification carefully and quietly, a law like this raised the stakes considerably, turning a private family matter into a question a state registrar could now decide by looking at a birth certificate alone. A cover story that had merely been convenient in 1840 became close to a legal necessity by 1924, and that shift in pressure is a large part of why so many Melungeon-descended families held so tightly to the Portuguese or Cherokee explanation for as long as they did, sometimes passing it down long after anyone in the family still remembered exactly why it mattered so much to keep saying it out loud. The sixth and final sign sits in the physical descriptions left behind by outsiders, people who had no reason to protect the family's legal standing and therefore considerably less reason to soften what they saw. Missionaries, land agents, and traveling ministers who passed through Hancock County in the 1800s left behind letters and reports describing the Ridge families in blunt terms, often using words like swarthy or dark-complexioned, occasionally speculating in print about Portuguese or Mediterranean or Turkish origin, theories that later DNA testing would not ultimately support but that tell you plainly how the community appeared to outside observers at the time, decades before anyone had the tools to test what was actually in their blood. These outside descriptions matter most when they line up with the fourth and fifth signs together. An outside observer's blunt account of appearance, sitting beside a family's own protective cover story, sitting beside a DNA result tracing African or native maternal ancestry inside an otherwise European profile, is a convergence that is difficult to explain any other way. When all six signs line up on a single family, genealogists working this history consider the case for hidden Melungeon ancestry essentially closed, even without a single surviving document that uses the word outright. The clearest piece of institutional evidence for how seriously this classification mattered comes from the story of the Vardy Presbyterian Mission School, founded in the valley below Newman's Ridge in the 1890s. Children from the Ridge families were barred from the county's white schools outright, and because the same families were not considered black under the law either, they were barred from the black schools too. They had, in the plainest legal sense, been placed nowhere at all. Caught inside a racial classification the school system had no category prepared to educate. It took a dedicated mission school, funded and staffed through Presbyterian home mission work, and built specifically for the Ridge community, to give an entire generation of Melungeon children any formal education whatsoever. Church records connected to that mission describe pupils arriving from families the surrounding county had refused to classify at all, which is its own kind of documentary evidence. A school built for children the law had effectively made invisible. That single fact, a community too ambiguous in the eyes of the law to be admitted anywhere, tells you more about the weight of this hidden classification than any court record could on its own. The Vardy school continued operating for decades, long after most one-room mission schools of its era had closed, and it was not until well into the 20th century, as public schools in the county were finally built out and desegregated, that the need for a separate mission school for the Ridge community quietly disappeared. Interest in this history has not disappeared along with the school. A nonprofit called the Melungeon Heritage Association formed in the 1990s specifically to document Ridge family genealogies, preserve what remains of the Vardy school buildings, and connect descendants who had scattered across the country back to the original Hancock County families. The association has hosted periodic gatherings for descendants, part reunion and part genealogical workshop, where families who grew up 5 states apart and never knew they were related discover a shared surname, a shared Ridge ancestor from the 1800s, and often a shared version of the same Portuguese or Black Dutch story that nobody in either branch of the family had ever been able to fully explain. Volunteers connected to the association have spent years cross-referencing court records, church registers, and land grants across Hancock and Hawkins counties, work that has quietly filled in gaps the original DNA study never had the resources to chase down on its own, and that continues to add new documented family lines to the surname list genealogists rely on today. The origin story itself has gone through its own long and public revision. In 1994, a writer and descendant named Brent Kennedy published a book called The Melungeons, arguing for a Mediterranean and Ottoman Turkish origin, a theory built partly on family tradition and partly on documentary speculation, and it brought the Melungeon story to a national audience for the first time in decades. The book sold widely, and for a while the Mediterranean and Turkish framing became the accepted popular explanation, repeated in newspaper features and local tourism material across East Tennessee. The DNA evidence that followed nearly 2 decades later did not support the Mediterranean or Turkish theory, and some family associations that had grown attached to the more exotic explanation were slow to accept what the genetic data actually showed, which is understandable enough given how long a Mediterranean origin had been treated as settled fact in local newspapers and family reunions alike. Roberta Estes and her co-researchers were careful in how they published their findings, presenting the Y-Chromosome and mitochondrial results as a direct answer to a question the earlier book had raised, rather than as an attack on the community's identity, and over time the DNA Project's conclusions have largely displaced the Turkish and Mediterranean framing among genealogists working the surname lines directly. What it supported instead was quieter, and in its own way more remarkable. An ordinary colonial American founding population, European, African, and Native American, that formed earlier and more informally than the official history of American race relations generally allows for, and that then spent 2 centuries defending itself against a legal system with no category prepared to hold it. The truth turned out to be less exotic than Turkish ancestry and considerably more American. If any of this sounds like your own family, the 6 signs give you a place to start rather than a verdict to accept on faith alone. Pull the census records for your Tennessee, Virginia, or Kentucky ancestors and look, decade by decade, at how the race column shifts underneath them. Check your family surnames against the documented Melungeon list, and check the counties your earliest known ancestors actually lived in against the ridges and hollows where those surnames concentrated. If you have already tested your DNA, go back and look specifically at your maternal haplogroup rather than only the general ethnicity estimate most people skim past and forget, because that is precisely where this particular history tends to hide in plain sight. And if your family has a Portuguese, Black Dutch, or Cherokee story that nobody has ever been able to fully explain or trace to an actual immigrant ancestor, you may be looking at the exact kind of protective cover story that generations of Appalachian families relied on to survive a legal system built to exclude them entirely. The Ridge families of Newman's Ridge and Vardy Valley did not vanish, and they did not stay hidden either, not entirely. They are sitting in county courthouses across 3 states. In church minute books nobody has reopened in 100 years, and in the maternal haplogroups of DNA test results that thousands of people have already received in the mail and never fully understood. Somewhere in a kitchen right now, someone is looking at their own ethnicity estimate and skipping past a small line near the bottom of the report, a trace percentage that does not match anything their family has ever said out loud, and moving on to the parts of the results that confirm what they already expected to see. If that line has ever caught your eye for half a second before you scrolled past it, go back and look at it properly. Pull the census records. Check the surname. Ask the oldest relative you still have what exactly Portuguese or Black Dutch or Cherokee was supposed to explain and where the family first heard it, and listen closely to how confidently or how uncomfortably they answer. 2 centuries of careful silence went into keeping that story sounding ordinary, built decade by decade out of a census entry here and a church record there, each one small enough on its own to pass without comment. It only takes one grandchild willing to ask the question twice, and to keep pulling the thread instead of putting it back down, to start taking that silence apart. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.